Welcome to Yeoman. I'm your host, Geoff Graham. I'm excited to have with me today my friend Aaron Lubeck. Aaron is a land planner and builder in Durham, North Carolina. He is the founder of Southern Urbanism. That's southernurbanism.org. He is board member and their development director. He writes, you can check them out at southernurbanism.org. Also check out Aaron's own writing on his Substack, which is aaronlubeck.substack.com. That's AARONLUBECK. His relatively new Substack, he's pretty prolific on it, is called onHousing with Aaron Lubeck. Aaron is also an outstanding follow on X. Today is the day I've decided to start calling it X. I'm no longer calling it Twitter. So Aaron_Lubeck. So AARON_LUBECK. He is a great, interesting, and fun person to follow there. Aaron, thank you for joining us. I'm glad to have you here.
I'm glad to be here. Been looking forward to this conversation for a while.
Yeah, we have, Aaron and I have probably known each other for about 2 years, and gotten to spend time together in real life a couple, 3 times. And he's just a delightful person, excited to chat with him about our built environment. Before we dive into your work, to Southern Urbanism, just share how did you come to find your way into working in the built environment?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one. My journey is now long enough where I don't think about it, so I don't know if I can compress it into a short story. But I'm a general contractor in North Carolina, and I'm one of the few, very, very few general contractors who came to the profession through small business experience and not carpentry. Most general contractors that I know of were kind of carpenters who got sick of having a boss. Mm-hmm. And I was in the small business startup world in the .com boom, which I think was 3 recessions ago now. And as a young man, came back to Chapel Hill to work on a .com startup that was effectively YouTube before YouTube, and it raised a bunch of money and lost it all. And out of that, helped a bunch of friends start their own companies. And while that was great and a whole variety of interesting things, felt sort of disconnected. And I mean, now I'm learning the language that I probably couldn't describe back then, but it was really seeking a rootedness that didn't have me on a plane 30% of my life, that had a home, that had some localized meaning, which of course parlayed into the built environment. So I learned construction, renovation, had a mentor that taught me a lot about the industry, and did that for about a year.
Was all of this in Durham?
Yeah, pretty much all North Carolina and the Triangle. Mm-hmm. We became more localized to Durham as time went on. Was really doing kind of brain dead carpet and paint renovations for probably a year to learn the cycle, and which kind of exists throughout, whether you're building something as pretty as Ion or as ugly as rehabbing a 1990s McMansion. Mm-hmm. The cycle is basically the same. And did that for about a year, and we partnered with my long-running development partner or building partner, Alan Sprite, who's founded Trinity Design Build. And we started doing historic restoration work. And once we published our phone number, the phone didn't stop ringing for about 10 years. And so 10 years ago, I left that company. He stayed on, but I've been more in the new urbanist world, doing design and construction on my own, and doing a lot of the advocacy work that you see in the publishing and reform work that I do.
I didn't know, or maybe we haven't spoken about it, that you began your career in tech and kind of the relatively early internet days.
That's right.
What year did you get started there?
Right at the turn of the millennium. I moved back to Chapel Hill right about 2000, and we had about what really felt like my MBA. I mean, I learned so much about business in a 18-month run, recruiting college students to shoot short videos that they would stream on the internet. And of course, back then you'd have to codify everything in real time or QuickTime, Real Player, Windows Media Player in 3 different speeds. Like, just to do a basic video would take you 2 hours to process, and the internet wasn't really fast enough to stream it for another 5 years anyway.
Did you? So I mean, you were a part of. You referred to 3 recessions ago. If only all of our recessions could be like that 2001 recession.
Yeah, exactly.
So you were there, you were in it for kind of at the beginning of the Web 2.0
That's
time.
right.
Yeah. Did you, now being in urbanism, so I came from construction to technology, to the internet, and you kind of had the opposite path.
Mm-hmm.
But I found when I started my software company in the early 2000s, I found the language of software in the Web 2.0 world was like so familiar to me from the language that we used in urbanism and community building and talking about network and as you enable sort of participation on your platform or in your neighborhood, or you facilitate that, you create more value for everybody that's on the platform. Did you have a sense of that back when you sort of came into urbanism?
Oh God, I was thinking you were going to ask me about the tech company, but in urbanism, I think that's accurate. And a lot of my work, marginal work right now, really focuses on trying to develop these micro communities. Mm-hmm. I'm a big believer that happiness and goodness and sort of peak condition of quality of life comes from these small communities, and they're difficult to develop. There's a whole debate over what is that scale. Ross Chapin calls it the scale of sociability. Is community 2 houses? Is it 200 houses? Is there a number inside that works or doesn't work for many reasons?
What was that? And the scale of sociability.
Sociability. Yeah. Ross would be a great guest for your show, by the way. He can really nerd out to that and some Christopher Alexander stuff, and is such a unique thinker in this space with experience. And he gets very technical on things. We actually pass out his book kind of as our business card when we're doing small land plans for local builders. It's just like, this is what we believe. And in some ways, he gets that sort of uber technical stuff that Christopher Alexander can, be guilty of. There's only 276 things you need to do, and then the development will work. But he really believes that, I'm going off memory here, but these micro communities, like 4 to 16 units is really the bookends of them. And in many ways, 8 to 12 is ideal. And at that point, everybody, you can trust everybody. You can have a relatively enclosed compound, not like, barbed wire physical stuff, but a single parent can let their kid play outside and be comfortable that eyes will be on the street. And there's enough of a buffer that strangers aren't going to be a threat. And it's simple. If you have a project that's larger than that, you just break it into smaller, 12 unit enclaves. And Ross has done some fascinating site plans that are, 100 or 200 units that are really just 12 pocket neighborhoods. And each one becomes its own little special space. My work, what I'd like to develop, and it's difficult to do, but adding some building developments that are that small, but have some intentionality to it, that build around some practice, that build around some, there's a great book by Nabil Hamdi that Bill Allison had recommended to me called Small Change. He identifies 5 different types of community, and I'll see if I can remember them off the top of my head, but it's communities of place, communities of culture, communities of hobby, communities of practice, and communities of resistance. And if you kind of categorize like this, it's not hard to design micro communities for each. And whether you're designing for Lutherans or yoga enthusiasts or political activists or musicians or podcasters or whatever, the amenity that takes a good place to great can be as simple as a 10 by 10 room that's designed to facilitate the practice. And it's really built around the fundamental principle that the primary offering of urbanism is shared amenity. And you get it whether you're in an Ion or in New York City. You have a coffee shop that you can share, or a tennis club, or a park, that everybody can live a higher quality of life simply by sharing the amenity, as opposed to the suburban alternative where all of the parks are privatized. Everybody's got a private playground in their backyard. Everybody has a private living room to basically watch sports or whatever, but everything's privatized. So I like this idea that at the micro scale of 10, 12 units, you can add some little tiny amenity that's not incredibly expensive. Nobody would be able to afford it on their own, but they would together. And in some ways, it's kind of what you're doing out at in the mountains, as I understand it.
Working on it. That's an interesting observation about the micro communities. When we talk, Vince and my dad and I, and so would encourage you. My two most recently published episodes have been me speaking with my brother and partner Vince and my dad and partner Tom about all kinds of things. Dad, it's mostly about his career.
Mm-hmm.
Vince, we sort of wander all over the place. But a thing that we have reflected on a good bit with Ions, which is 244 acres. There is 244 acres, 762 home sites so far. And but we have a bunch of boroughs in the neighborhood, but they're really sort of just boroughs in name only. If we could do it all over again, among the many zillion things we would do differently is probably, instead of developing Ion, we would have developed Eastlake and Ponsbury and Ionsboro and all these other little micro neighborhoods, and been more intentional about creating much smaller places where people have a greater sense of identity and connection to that neighborhood rather than the larger Ion. I think that Ion's a pretty tight community.
Mm-hmm.
I think we could have tightened it up. Like there would have been stronger community bonds if we had made it each borough, the neighborhood instead.
I like it. It's like Pink Floyd arguing the Dark Side of the Moon, like could have been more perfect, right? Critiquing Ion for that. The new urbanist on the outside is like
a lot of things to critique.
I think that's fair. I do agree with that, though. I mean, Ion is so well done, and most importantly, it's mostly finished. Which a lot of these things are probably most new urbanist communities ever are either not started or in process. Like to actually finish and exit something for the most part is pretty remarkable. But I do think there's something there that fragmenting out the larger, and this is probably a metaphor for across some of the stuff we're going to talk about today. I working in Durham and engaging with Duke, which is the elephant in the room in a city like Durham. Mm-hmm. There's this fascinating challenge of how do you get big.
You mean Duke University?
Duke University.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. Of course, his money went from tobacco to energy to, once he died, was a philanthropic giver to the school that I think it's 101 years old now this year. But how does big catalyze small is one of the great challenges of our time, because everything is getting bigger. Everything is becoming more unmanageable, and sort of whether it's corporatized, big government or big business, and sort of takes away that scale of social ability, takes away that humanizing factor. And in many ways, a university is better equipped to catalyze small than a Leviathan state or a Coca-Cola corporation or something like that. Because they, for a lot of reasons, they're more connected to urbanism. Colleges are fundamentally urban places with walkability and so forth. But the issue is like when Duke would take out a 500,000 square feet of downtown Durham to catalyze it, which was on balance a very good thing. When you're building at that scale, how do you not take the letter of credit tenant of Starbucks instead of the local coffee shop owner? Like the pressures are so great once you become so big, to make everything monolithic, to make everything simple, to make everything streamlined. And you really see how severe the situation is in America when you go abroad. Just nothing is this. I mean, everything in America is just too damn big.
Why do you, I mean, it's one of the recurring themes here on Yeoman. It is observably true that the sort of scale has become less human over the last 150 years. Mm-hmm. What are the main culprits? What do you point to for that? Like why?
Yeah, I mean, there's I know we're getting into some of the Kingsnorth work of the machine, but I think or his writing on the series on the machine. But I think this was the inevitable end game of the West and digitization, the digital age, which is basically started during our lifetimes. And we've sort of witnessed it go from corporate computers to home computers to ubiquity of phones. And now you can have anything you ever wanted at any time, at your door in minutes and so forth. And I think the ubiquity of that has just accelerated everything. We're too data obsessed. And one of the great quotes that came out of I went to the Front Porch Republic conference last year that you had recommended me to, and really interesting people. And there was totally blanking on her name, but it was a young academic from University of Virginia who gave a great talk. And she had this quote that really stuck with me. And it's that the modern world destroys everything that cannot be quantified. And so as the digital world has progressed and data sets have been ubiquitous and huge, more and more people work on processing that data. Of course, data sets can show our growth rates are 3%, sales are down 2% or whatever. But what are the things they can't process? They can't process love. They can't process purpose. They can't process meaning. And all these things that are humanizing are basically thrown out the door. And so you and I deal with this all the time in land use. I mean, whether you're talking about politicians or planners or even in the corporate world, people are just saying, well, show me the data and we'll make a decision. Just show me the data. Right? And there's this culture about that really discounts all the things that matter.
Do you that sounds like something that predates the the creation of computers and so forth?
I think it's certainly accelerated, partially because we didn't have these huge data sets. I mean, my old business partner, Alan Sprite, had a 20-year career in public health before he came to work with me fixing old houses. And he said when he started Family Health International, a nonprofit that did a lot of reproductive health work in Africa, probably in the late 80s, maybe early 90s, they would get on a plane to go from Raleigh to London to Africa just to process a fax, and then they would come back. So the idea that just the digital age has accelerated things where everything accelerates, and that I think has put increased pressure on counting the things that you can count and discounting the things that you can't. And that has had a negative effect on quality of life and a pressure to grow everything. And it's made everything bigger and more professionally managed, for better or for worse.
Right.
And so I think it is very difficult. I mean, the 50s were a corporate time, but it's just the digital underpinnings of our economy matter, and they homogenize everything, and they create an extraordinary pressure to toe the party line.
It sounds like you're saying with the ability to measure, when things become measured, that pulls all of our attention to the measured things. Yeah. So like the drunk man looking for his car keys under the street light, and the guy comes to help him. He's like, oh, hey, can I help you? And they look around for the keys under the street light, and they can't find them. And finally he's like, are you sure you left him right here? He's like, oh, no, I have no idea. Like, well, why are we looking here? He's like, well, this is where the light is. But that also reminds me of Russ Roberts, or I probably got that quote from Russ Roberts' Econ Talk podcast, but he's like, not everything that is measured matters, and not everything that matters can be measured. I'm sure plenty of people have said that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think, and I'm running into some variation of that more and more as I get older. And I do think it's tough. I mean, and you see, because in land use and in small business, you're up against these forces that are so rigid, and these are the rules. The rules are the rules. They're binary. They're off on, and
And you're referring to both, or the combination of building codes, zoning, financing requirements for kind of conventional financing paths.
And everything, even if a computer is not processing requests for any of those things, functionally, even many of the humans that are processing that are acting like a computer, does this fit in the box? Does this check or not? And there's no variability because of the overemphasis on data and rulemaking. And as the rule book grows, it becomes a large, unworkable software functionally. And too many of the filters in it
turns people into automatons.
It does. And that the issue in your software company, you can fix those things, but in a process with 30 people that need to approve something and 25 of them are not functioning, you can't get anything done. And so this is not like it's not a dystopian future to describe that. I think you cannot build a new urban, walkable, mixed use community pretty much in any college town anymore. Your brother Vince had a quote, super simple, but really stuck with me. He said he's been doing this for 40 years and it hasn't gotten easier. That's a canary in the coal mine, a red flag. And also, at the ION dialogues last year, we were looking at, could you do an ION today? Could you do a cat fiddle today? He's like, oh no way. Not in today's, world. I can't remember if he was pinpointing social media or the participatory planning realities.
Yeah, he was. I think that observation came both from how real estate development gets financed nowadays, and also the greater difficulty people have in gaining entitlements for larger projects. I agree with that sentiment, and we've talked about it with other people here. At the same time, I am really optimistic. Like I think the idea of human scaled systems, human scaled communities, like a human scale built environment, like that was a sort of a fringe topic in the mid 90s and even the early 2000s. And Kirkpatrick Sale has a great book and a great follow-up. It's called Human Scale, and Human Scale Revisited. That's a worthwhile read. But people that were writing about this a long time ago, Christopher Alexander, they were not, fringe might not be the right word, but they were esoteric. People weren't really paying attention to them. But nowadays, like everybody, not everybody, but, a great many people are well aware of the absence of human scale in their human scale things in their environment, in their world. And so as hard as it is to get stuff done, to battle against the machine, there has never been more awareness that the machine exists.
I think that's right. Whether it's beatable or treatable is an open question. I do think more people are aware of these issues. The movement has spread, and so it's wider. Whether it's deeper or not, we could argue. I describe it this way, and this is a sort of forced analogy, so forgive me. I really believe we're, for the most part, this movement is the followers of Jane Jacobs. She was, and every 30 years, there's a new generation that stands up and says, no, we're doing it wrong. This isn't okay. And stop it. And I'm going to take some extreme action to get you to stop it, and so forth. So in 1960, that was Jane Jacobs kicking Robert Moses in the nuts in Washington Square Park, metaphorically speaking. And in the 1990s, that was the new urbanists, who were the young, ragtag, pissed off land planners. We need to talk about this because I have a totally different view. Okay. Well, and I think now, 30 years later, there's the YIMBY movement. That is so at each level it becomes wider, and in many ways, and you're going to love this because it'll be provocative enough for you to poke holes in it. Jane Jacobs was the sort of a messiah figure for urbanism. The new urbanists were more of the proselytizers and then down into the flock, which are the people who are pissed off that they don't have homes, that are actually doing now the groundswell of advocacy that the new urbanists couldn't do by sheer numbers. There weren't enough of them. So that's what I see happening, and I think it does align with your optimistic feeling that the movement is broadening and it's becoming a dining room table issue, and it's talked about by politicians now, which was, last cycle was the first time American presidential candidates had ever talked about zoning.
Yeah. I mean,
So-
like on a local level, you've got states and cities abolishing exclusionary zoning now. Like that's a big deal. That was not, there's no possibility of that 10 years ago. And I think we're going to see more of it, this desire to roll back the damage done from a lot of both Supreme Court decisions and then state and local level decisions in the early part of the last century that we're feeling the impacts of. I want to come back to say I think it's useful to on Robert Moses. Plenty of my New Yorker friends who are from there, they're like, oh yeah, a lot of people love Robert Moses. Kind of view him as a hero. I'm like,
he built parks.
I'm like, whoa, that is just not the view I have of that person, or from Power Broker, or at least how urbanist type people think of him. But I do think the Robert Moses, Jane Jacobs dichotomy is a useful one, but I think we see it all over. It wasn't just in urbanism. You also had Wendell Berry versus Earl Butz, the Secretary of Agriculture, and them, having this big feud at the same time, and it totally having play. If you look at sort of who won, you may say that Jane Jacobs kicked Robert Moses in the nuts, but I think Robert Moses won that battle.
On a societal scale.
On a societal scale, on a societal scale.
On a social scale, she made him a weak, frail man who sort of, died mentally ill. He was mentally ill while he was practicing too. But you're right. I mean, his vision for the world, which is a suburban, which is segregated, which is, showering the rich while sort of isolating the poor, which is anti-democratic, relatively authoritarian.
I mean, he would not have said it. He would not have described it that way, but in effect, that's what it became.
Absolutely. And in fairness, there's this phenomenal series that 99% Invisible is doing right now, a year-long book club reading The Power Broker.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's
because it takes that long.
It does. And it is really well put together. They have a pretty amazing guest every month. They've had Conan O'Brien on. They actually had Robert Caro on, who's still, 88 years old and still writing, who has the most wonderful New York accent you'll ever hear. And they had on, actually, you'll like this. They had on, have you watched 30 Rock? Do you know?
A little bit, yeah.
So the Leslie Knope character, they actually had on the creator of that show to kind of talk about his experience with Robert Moses and reading the book. And he said he wrote Leslie Knope, the Amy Poehler character, who was sort of the anchor of that show. He said, we wrote her to be Robert Moses if Robert Moses was altruistic and had a good heart. And I said, oh, wow, that makes sense. Like that's.
So I want to come back to a comment you said, and it's on our list of things to chat about. A few things I want to also eventually, I don't want to forget to come back and talk about the beginnings of Southern Urbanism, southernurbanism.org, and then also Urbanism in the South. But before we get to that, I want to talk about this thing that the new urbanists sort of are in the 90s, maybe early aughts, late 80s through the early aughts. We're carrying the torch of Jane Jacobs. I don't see that at all. I really don't. I feel like Jane Jacobs wrote beautifully about emergent order. And my experience in new urbanism is that there aren't a lot of new urbanists who appreciate emergent order. They may want the form of a small community or a human scaled community. They may want the form of it, but and I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but generally the most prominent voices in the new urbanism movement have more in common with central planners than with who are the arch enemies of Jane Jacobs.
Correct.
Than Jane Jacobs. So what's your take on that?
So there's a couple things I would add to that. And I think it's a contextual thing. So you kind of come from the tradition of new urbanism, of greenfield development. And in fairness, that's most of what new urbanism has executed. Ion, Seaside, Serenbe, Trilith, all these are stunningly beautiful neighborhoods that were built in, cornfields or treat areas.
Mm-hmm.
There really is a pretty big split in the practice of new urbanism between the incrementalists who are doing infill development and the greenfield, new field developments. And I do think we can get into that on the incrementalist side, it is very much in the tradition of Jane Jacobs, that it's strong towns, next increment up. Where's the next row building at the end of your neighborhood commercial district? How do you incrementally increase a neighborhood while keeping its character? How do you legalize duplexes and ADUs and get rid of parking mandates? And it's this whole world of sort of incremental reform.
To me, that's the YIMBY movement.
It is.
I think that the CNU kind of came to that a bit reluctantly. Following the last recession, or maybe when there just was not any new big projects being done anymore, that market went away for a while.
And in fairness, I'm as critical of the CNU as others, but I think the CNU is big. It's a Congress. There's a wide array of political, and some people think only high society architecture should be done. Some people love the $30,000 house, like scrappy sort of rural studio Auburn type thing. All of that's valid, and I think there's a lot of crossover between the movements, and I believe that urbanism will take off and become the movement, not a movement, when the two movements align. That's new urbanism and YIMBYism. I believe they're basically rooted in the same ethic and the same church, which, as aforementioned, I think are in the spirit of Jane Jacobs. And there's a weird tension, which we can get into, between the two, but I think they're fundamentally the same movement. I don't want to discount. Well, I
don't know. I mean, you read the charter. I was at the Congress where the charter was unveiled for CNU, for the charter of the Congress of New Urbanism, and it was a document I didn't sign because it was actually kind of hostile to respect for the individual, and it was very much these things. It was very much what should be done to communities. That was my read of it, and I may be unfair or just getting to be more crotchety as I get on, but I do remember those early discussions. There was not a lot of appreciation for emergent order. Well, and there's a lot of celebration of Jane Jacobs, but it was the form of what Jane Jacobs celebrated, right, not the how it came to be.
Which is a little bit of the planners co-opting of Jane Jacobs believes that that you can mandate incrementalism and you can design incrementalism. And I think your critique is fair. We've all seen the new urban communities that are sort of like pastiche, or the strip malls that are tried to be made to look like, oh, look, it's organically done. Every building's different. It's like, no, they're not. Each one's skin different. Well, I wanted to go back though to what you were talking about with, is new urbanism just, oppressive central zoning by a different name? And I think that there's a fundamental difference when you look at the great new urban communities, is that all of them will have HOAs. Just that's the reality of modern development. They'll have a storm pond. They'll usually have some amenities or some common thing that you have to hold together as an HOA. I don't love that. I live in a historic district partially because I don't want to live in an HOA community, but anything new today will have that for a variety of reasons. And so we know the reality is that nobody, to my knowledge, has ever tried to build or to build a new community in the spirit of what old historic neighborhoods like the one you live in or I live in was done, which in my understanding, Trinity Park in Durham was bought by Ben Duke, the brother of James Buchanan Duke. He subdivided it into, 5th acre parcels, and he let people build on it. And to some degree, I don't think there was any record of setbacks or covenants that required that. Everybody just sort of built.
What years were
1904?
Yeah,
neighborhood was platted.
Right.
There's no record of any sort of standards for setbacks at that time, and people just kind of did it. And there's some random missing middle that's actually quite charming. So some of it was just an ethic that's just what you did. Like you just wouldn't build a 10-story skyscraper or something with a 0-foot setback if your neighbors didn't. But for a variety of reasons, that's not possible today. I mean, you wouldn't have just platted Ion and hoped people built cool stuff.
Well, we couldn't. It would have we couldn't have gotten the entitlements to enable people to do that absent an HOA. That was effectively a requirement for our PUD. And then additionally, there's an enormous amount of pressure for if you want to sell lots to people from outside the state to comply with the Interstate Land Sales Act, that you essentially, over a certain size, you essentially have to have an HOA. You're sort of obligated to. We could have set our HOA up differently, where it would have functioned much more like a garden club does. And if you have that in your community, or I have it in mine, where it's totally volunteer and volunteer supported. Yeah. And we probably should have done that. Mm-hmm. But we could not have done what you just described the Dukes having done. Yeah. That would have not been, and it wouldn't have been politically possible to develop that way.
And it's a gradient. I get that. Like some new urbanist communities today are more restrictive than others and more prescriptive.
However, like I'll say where we are right now in Glenville, this, Big Ridge Mountain Club is on unrestricted land. Like though there's not really a market out here for that. So the market doesn't exist. And so because the market doesn't exist, the restrictive regulatory environment hasn't emerged yet.
True.
But theoretically, we could do that here. I could do that right here.
Well, so the main thing that I think you're missing in your thesis of kind of comparing heavy-handed new urbanism to heavy-handed central planning is there's a voluntary and coercive split between the two. So everybody who buys into Big Ridge or Ion or Serenbe or anything does so voluntarily. Zoning was retroactively pushed upon people and still is against their will. And that's a fundamental difference.
How was that? So I think that's a great point. And one, actually, that libertarians, lowercase l libertarians, they make all the time that, hey, HOAs are awesome. HOAs are voluntary. No one's forced into the HOA, though there is, and zoning is imposed by the state, whatever the local level or whatever level it's imposed on people, and they don't have a real choice whether or not they take it on. What happens though in the dynamic that I just described, where effectively, if you're going to build a new community, this is not across the board, but effectively you're going to have an HOA.
That's right.
And so there is what did Illich call it? A radical monopoly in HOAs, where like there's not one HOA for everything, but HOAs are everywhere. So you really don't have an option to not have an HOA. And not everybody is buying a new house. Eventually people are, have to have an option to go move into a place, rent or buy a home that's governed by this ideology of HOA. So HOAs are everywhere. How does an HOA then become all that different than zoning?
I think it's a valid thesis that over time they become similar, and this is one of the appeals. I mean, it's probably an underappreciated reason that historic districts sell at a premium, because there really is a pretty big market of people who want nothing to do with that.
I totally agree. Yeah. There's a desire in our neighborhood. There's always every 5 or 10 years, some people who move into the neighborhood from other places want to come in and they're like, we need an HOA. We need to make this. We need to actually designate this as a protected historic area where there's design guidelines and all these things. And there's a huge uprising from the community. These are older houses. Our neighborhood was largely built from the early 1900s to the 1950s. There's a huge uprising in the community. You're like, we're not doing any of that stuff.
I think that's right. And I know it gets back to the same sort of Leviathan homogenizing everything, because the trigger in North Carolina, for example, is if you're building really any project that's in many ways over 3 units, but certainly over 10, you're going to be required to do a storm pond. Well, if you're required to do a storm pond, you're required to have an HOA. And if once you have an HOA, then all the people are into it and have to pay into it, even if it's small and docile and not, oppressive in any way. So it is a huge problem and one that is underappreciated and really nobody's working on.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah. It's kind of these little insidious things that are these little tiny insidious rules that have this huge ripple effect.
And there's probably, like, if you were going to deal with that, we kind of walked this plank a year or two ago. I think storm ponds like sidewalks they're infrastructure that are very prone to be targeted by sort of the anti-development people who want to, blame you for everything. That they say, well, the developer should provide these things, even though fundamentally they're sort of civic level infrastructure, particularly sidewalks. And the same, I know Atlanta's done some really interesting things with stormwater, where you can just at the scale, it's all about like, where do you apply the right scale? Do you make every building provide its own storm pond? Do you make every neighborhood do it? Do you make every development do it? These are all sort of reasonable questions, but the regulatory environment makes it happen usually at the development level. And so you end up with all these sort of ugly ponds that aren't necessarily the most efficient way to treat on a citywide scale. And so I think a lot of these problems that people don't realize, like the inevitability of an HOA, are resulted from sort of punitive targeting of the developer to pay for things that really aren't actually appropriately scaled for that size. And I know that there's two really interesting storm pond projects on each side of downtown Atlanta that are effectively like right in the park, that are sort of a civic storm pond that that serves hundreds of private properties. And all those property owners would be thrilled to just pay into that rather than do these huge tanks under each property separately.
Yeah.
But that's like,
you're talking about Old Fourth Ward, the big pond in Old Fourth Ward.
There's that. And then there's the park that's right to the west of the football stadium, over near English Avenue, is my understanding. Kronberg's told me about that a few times.
I should, my sister works for the City of Atlanta's Department of Watershed, and she wrote, landscape architect, and wrote her thesis in college on City of Atlanta's stormwater. This is, decades ago, their stormwater systems and how to turn those into parks. And a lot of those ideas were implemented in the city. I like to think directly from ideas that I'll get her.
And of course, Glenwood Park, one of the best examples of a smaller version of that the park is the overflow for the storm pond, and it serves double duty.
Oh, Seaside is too. Yeah.
Yeah. And we don't understand that, like, and then when you apply that, you lose buildable land. So you lower revenue, you increase costs. You're sort of, all these negative things come from sort of applying this at the wrong scale, including probably detaining less stormwater. So I'd close that thought by saying, I don't even think you're allowed to have that conversation in North Carolina. Like, hey, what if we did this at the neighborhood scale as opposed to the development scale? Is that better? Where could it go? Are there places in line on the main river where we could build amenities and parks around these stormwater features? Like, you can't have that conversation. And it's just, we keep kind of going along on the dumb way of doing it. It's expensive and results in worse outcomes.
It is too, when you get into these kind of wonky topics in real estate development. One of the things I hope is with, maybe with listeners of this, when we go down these sort of wonky paths on land development, is there are a lot of people out there that are like, real estate developers are so stupid. It'd be so easy to build beautiful, wonderful things. And the reality is, if real estate development was only about designing and building something that you can bring to market profitably, there'd be a lot more beautiful stuff than there is.
Would. I mean, it'd be an interesting question to ask Vince or yourself. I was thinking about it this morning of like, actually, no, I was in a conversation last night. Like, I've been in practice 22 years, something like that. Like, what percentage of my working hours have been dealing with the dumbest stuff that has nothing to do with designing and building better places?
Well, I will tell you, that's what pushed me out of real estate development and kind of pushed me toward technology in 2002. It was, we were, it was maybe 6 years into the development, 5 years into the development of ION. And I was, in the division of our responsibilities within the business. Vince is our general manager, general partner, and I was head of construction, which included, vertical and horizontal stuff and and infrastructure and permitting and all those sorts of things. And I spent easily half my time, maybe closer to 2/3 of my time, seeking permission to do things.
Yeah.
And I looked over at technology, internet, and you're like, you don't pull any building permits. Like you literally design what you want to design, come up with it, and bring it to market. Yeah. And people can buy it if they want. And I've thought about this a lot. Like, would Steve Jobs have ever? Yeah. What if Steve Jobs could have had expressed his creativity in the built environment? Yeah. Like,
or the corollary, what if Steve Jobs had to get approval for the iMac through the neighborhood listserv? Like,
oh yeah, totally. I mean, like, well, no, your device is going to have to be this size. Yeah. It's going to have to weigh this much. Yeah. Or what if a chef had to? We talk about this a lot. What if a chef had to be subject to this? Like, oh yeah, everything you add to your menu, you're going to have to run it through the permitting process. Mm-hmm. Every meal that is delivered is going to have to be inspected. Yeah.
It's insane. And I do think both of my kids are sort of interested in architecture and land planning, entering college age against my strong judgment or advice. But I people ask all the time, like, where are we going to be in 10, 20 years? Or what are the things we look back upon now and be like, God, that was dumb. And I do think that sooner than later, they're going to look back upon the literature, the huge amount of literature on how we did participatory planning and just be completely appalled at what we did in this era, because it is proving to be overwhelmingly inequitable.
Well, and I think as another reason for optimism, I think that people recognize that so much now, that they recognize or increasingly recognize why things look as they are. It's not because humans aren't capable of amazing, beautiful things or that we're any less capable of it. It's the sclerosis that we have to navigate to get them now. And I think we're pushing back on it. I actually think I think the pendulum is about to begin swinging back to some wonderful spot.
I'll share that optimism with you. And I think in many ways, the people who are obstructing all these incremental changes, broadly sort of labeled as NIMBYs, are losing. And Alan Durning, who's the director of Sightlines Institute in Seattle, had a great quote. He's like, we're winning, but we're winning so slowly, we might as well be losing. Right. And it feels like that.
Yeah.
And I do think there's so much overreach now. The other quote is relevant is Amory Lovins, who ran the Rocky Mountain Institute until retiring recently, said, you're making progress when the status quo starts to freak out. Like that's the signal. And we're seeing such dramatic overreach now by some of the NIMBY advocacy. We're seeing the most frivolous lawsuits, like at face value, the wealthiest of wealthiest people who live in, 10,000 square foot mansions, not even big mansions, just mansions on huge lots, filing lawsuits to argue that, small duplexes are a threat to the environment. Like that's basically what happened in Minneapolis. Incidentally, Walz, the VP candidate, overrode that preemptively with basically exempting comp plans from environmental review, which was the obstruction tool that they were using, which is interesting. And we're going to see more and more of that. And it's in many ways, I'll be off brand and share your optimism for a second. I do think it's actually a great sign when the pessimistic NIMBYs overreach, because there's always a backlash, and it's usually legislative, and it's usually at the state level now. And that tip of the iceberg or early stage on the curve is pretty obvious. I mean, it used to just be.
Can you elaborate on that? You said is the backlash usually state level?
It is, and this is a Californian tool. The Californian YIMBY movement has mostly been successful at state preemptive legislation, and they've passed literally dozens of laws. Every year there's a new set of laws to make it easier to build housing in the state that probably had the worst planning ever in the history of planning. And it's interesting play there because it's a blue state handcuffing blue cities essentially and taking away their right to obstruct duplexes and ADUs, affordable housing, and all these things. I will say that's a bad place to go because it has this sort of anti-localism approach and runs the risk of broad brush, state level, one size fits all.
You mean state level intervention on local decisions like that?
And
can we finish your thought? But I want to come back to that.
I'm probably going to make the same point you're about to make too. That if there's a big difference between a state saying you have to do this, you have to put duplexes here, and all that, as opposed to saying cities can no longer restrict X, Y, and Z, which actually frees the humans to go build the city that they need and want to build. And good state level branch is doing that. California's doing that in their defense.
Yeah. I think that's a good point. And I hear opponents of zoning liberalization in the kind of the original sense of the term liberalization. I hear opponents talk about it as like, they're going to force me to build apartment building here. I'm like, no. There may be some legislation out there, some people trying to do that, but what they're going to do is they're going to allow you to.
Correct.
It's not they're going to force you to. And on the statewide thing, I have to say, I think that we talk about it a lot on this podcast, but it was the most local entity is the individual and that individual's property. And it was the highest level overreach that took that individual's rights away. It was a very bad Supreme Court decision in 1926 that said a property owner, no matter where they are in the country, a property owner no longer has the right to use their property as they want. A municipality's desire to decide what may be built there overrides the property owner. So it was a federal level intervention that enabled, San Francisco or Oakland or Berkeley or whatever to create the kind of zoning that they did and took away an individual's right. It was like the most anti-localist thing ever that happened. And I think it's pretty cool that now states are coming back and being like, hey, no, we're not.
Yeah. Which is where things are supposed to, that we're a state level sort of in the federalist system. The states are supposed to have the authority more than cities. And most of the states, I believe, are Dillon's rule states, where cities in North Carolina.
What is Dillon's rule?
So there's Dillon's rule states and home rule states. Mm-hmm. The simplest way to describe it as Dillon's rule states, the cities have no right to do anything unless the state specifically grants them that right.
Yeah.
So they're more state-based. The cities are more handcuffed.
This would be a product of the state constitution.
I think that's right. And so, for example, you see it happen with localized building codes. Some West Coast states and Tennessee had cities that adopted their own building code, which is pretty remarkable because then you can do things like single stair towers or mass timber or whatever. But in North Carolina, you can't. It all has to be done at the state level. Cities have no right to adopt their own building code. So there's a lot of benefits to that, mostly because it handcuffs the cities from doing dumb things. And I think a lot of the South in particular is built upon those systems, which has kept things relatively more free.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's a good opportunity to segue into two topics I want to get into. Let's talk about both Southern Urbanism and Southern Urbanism. So southernurbanism.org. Tell me about the origins tell me about Southern Urbanism. Tell me about its origins.
Yeah. So I started a magazine called Southern Urbanism. A nonprofit started about 3 years ago. We were in print publication last year.
Quarterly, right? When you started.
That's right. Yeah. And we had a great team put together with art direction and editors and a board and so forth. And the model originated actually out of conversations I had while out in Seattle and getting to know Alan Durning, the executive director of Sightlines Institute, and really appreciating their work. They present really as a think tank or kind of they're really an action tank that is hyper local to the region of the Pacific Northwest and is doing extraordinary writing, research, and advocacy in four silos: democracy, transportation, climate, and land use. And really, a lot of the great legislative changes in the Pacific Northwest, where there's a lot, you can trace back to that organization. And the people there, they're writing the persuasive cases, they're doing the advocacy work, and they're extraordinarily effective because they're local. And I guess I can differentiate this from somebody like Strong Towns, which is kind of a national brand, who's doing great work. But if Strong Towns comes to Seattle or Atlanta, they'll get some people to show up and they may get some compliments, but they're really not around long enough or rooted long enough to have that same effect as something that's hyper local. And so we looked at that in the South, which population wise is 10 times as big as the Pacific Northwest. I mean, a third of the population of the country now lives in the South. And there's nothing like that. And there was nowhere for practitioners who wanted to do better to learn and to share ideas and to just grow the practice of betterment from DC to El Paso. There's nothing out there, not even a blog you could really point to. And so our goal was to kind of model what Sightlines did and bring it to the South and create a smaller ecosystem where practitioners were sharing those ideas for betterment. And
and you made the pivot to all digital last year before?
We did, yeah. I've lost track of time, but now we're all digital. Probably publish about one long form piece a week, sometimes two. We've had a great relationship with students who are committed to be future practitioners, who enjoy the engagement with some of the best people in practice. And so you can subscribe via the Substack. And we're shifting a bit more towards events and programming. Last year, we brought the Better Cities Film Festival, which is a phenomenal library of the best films on urban topics and urbanism. It shows every year in Detroit and is a really great film festival. I think it's playing in September for those that are interested. But we've licensed that for exclusive distribution in the South, which last February we did it. We'll do it again this February. And,
great.
It's a great tool just to bring people together.
Will that be like the... We've gone a handful of times to I think it's called the Rocky Mountain Film Festival, which is an outdoor, outdoor oriented films. It's sort of that for urbanism.
A little bit. There's about 4 days of programming each year in Detroit, so it's extremely well curated. I went last year and was honestly expecting it to be not great content. If I thought it would have the normal HGTV arc. It's like, hey, my name's Geoff. I found this old building. It was in really bad shape, but we took it on. Oh, we almost went bankrupt, but then we figured it out. Yay. Like just a bunch of those. And they're really, really good films. So with the breadth of topics and well produced and some provocative and a lot of things I probably disagree with at face value, but like catalyzing interesting conversations. Yeah. The reality, the world today is in more multimedia than reading. There's a limitation to print journalism and I think even blogging, where more people are on social media and more people are craving events. And so the film festival can be really powerful to bring people together and further ideas and accelerate betterment.
So is that started yet for this year?
The Detroit one will be in September. I believe it's the 17th, but don't quote me on that. And I think it's bettercitiesfilmfestival.com. If you Google it, you'll find it. And it's really good. It's a fun festival. And they do some of it outdoors. And a lot of it last year was at Wayne State. And relatively small and cozy. There's just really interesting people there. Detroit's beautiful, especially this time of year. And again, for people in the South, we'll be in Durham again in February.
It'll be in Durham, and you said distribution rights in the South. So will it only be in Durham? Will you do it in other cities?
It's an open question. Obviously, putting on a film festival is a lot of work, and much of this is property of Chris Elisara and the Paget brothers. That they're excited to expand it and grow it because they've done a phenomenal job curating this library where they have perpetual license to show these films before a live audience. And really, I think it's a matter of finding the sponsors to, bring it to a place like Atlanta. So I do know that there's a desire to do that. That's basically their business model. We just have a exclusive license on the multi-day festival. So we can get enough people to Durham to make it worthwhile.
Well, great. I look forward to that. If it doesn't escape Durham this year, then I'll try and get up there and experience it.
That'd be great.
Some other things I want to make sure and then also let's go from sort of southernurbanism.org to also talk about a little bit about urbanism in the South. Why is it that all the best stuff, the most beautiful architecture, the greatest things are all in the South? And I'm not talking about just everything in general. I'm speaking particularly about urbanism.
Yeah. And it's lots
I'm kind of joking. There's some great things outside.
My family roots are in
St. serious too.
My family roots are in St. Louis, which I think per capita might have the best architecture of anywhere in the country. That has just beautiful, beautiful stuff that actually is a mix of different, German, Germanic, and French.
Where do St. Louisians, what would you call yourself?
That's a great question.
People? Where would people from St. Louis, what region would they consider themselves in?
All of them. They're kind of the Texas of the Midwest.
Yeah.
So it's the gateway to the West, but it's probably the western edge of the East. It's the southern edge of the Rust Belt, but the northern edge of the South. It's a very religious town, but very sinful. You got the beer and the blues, but also devoutly religious. And I mean, it's like a city of paradoxes. And also the mecca of some of the worst racial zoning and planning exercises really in the country happen there as well.
There. And I didn't know that. I've always thought Illinois was the capital of that.
There's a close connection between the two, but some really racial zoning laws were started in St. Louis, where 3/4 laws, where if your street was 3/4 black or white, it had to stay that way. The Shelley versus Kramer case, which eliminated racial covenants in the 50s, was a St. Louis case. Dred Scott happened there. I mean, it's a whole, and then down to Ferguson and so forth. All the suburbs are very balkanized. The city was more abandoned by white suburban flight than probably any other city in America. And there's a great book called Mapping Decline, which kind of shows this visually over time. That's really an interesting read. So
when we talk about the great beauty of St. Louis, we consider it a southern city then. Is that right?
It's a stretch, but because the great
Istanbul or something.
And I would say because the great architecture that is there is very French and Germanic, and there's actually an extraordinary collection of prairie style architecture, which doesn't exist in the South at all. I mean, that's an emphatically Chicago school style. Anyway, back to your question. I think the South has some of the great architecture that there's an old quote like poverty is a great friend of preservation, I think is a great description of why Charleston is still beautiful. It was too poor to knock
Couldn't
down.
afford to tear it down, right? There's a lot of that. I see that in Rome, Georgia, or Chattanooga, or there's all these really beautiful places that just, unlike Atlanta, didn't have the money to totally tear down their beautiful, amazing places.
And even I think that there's also a lot of beauty that comes out of not poverty, but frugality. And we see this in North Carolina architecture more than South Carolina or Virginia, which sort of have a froofier sheen to it all. I think North Carolina is the practical, neighbor compared to the other two. And that frugality leads a lot of really interesting architecture. I'm just more interested in a creatively built, affordable home for $200,000 than I am the $3 million Hilton Head home. It's it's more interesting. I think that gets down to the idea of limits and constraints yield beauty. And when you don't have it, exorbitant wealth, more often than not, results in ostentatiousness and stupidity and stuff that's not
some
pretty.
cool thing that, some amazing cathedrals and I wouldn't say at all that the greatest architecture in America is in the South, but I mean, a lot of it is. I would say, though, that it seems as if the greatest new things are in the South, whether I think in the United States, where the classicists are doing the most work is in the South, where most really aesthetically successful or even economically successful new walkable communities, they tend to be in the South. They almost all are.
The two theses on that: one, it's where the growth is, so there's demand, and you need that to build. If you're in a Buffalo,
there's a market.
A stagnant city, you're rehabbing, not building new. So a Buffalo, nobody's going to build a Ion in Buffalo because the demand's not there. And then the regulatory environment is less. That's changing very quickly, and I think that is an absolute threat to walkable communities. I would say there's almost near certainty that there will never be a walkable traditional neighborhood built in Durham, North Carolina, just because of the planning environment and it'll get killed. 751 South is probably the last one. And you would be hard pressed to name really any great traditional neighborhoods in college towns because they align with the kind of planning that just destroys them. I mean, nobody's even proposed one.
That's a pretty strong statement. Never.
Almost.
I would, or like never will. Durham's never going to see one. That's a pretty strong statement.
It's. I saw what happened with the last one, 751 South, which was designed by Tony Cease and Dan Jewell and some local folks. It's a really, really beautiful land plan. Mm-hmm. What happens mostly with these in North Carolina, because we have a more difficult planning process than most other states for a lot of reasons. It took them 10 years to get entitlements. They spent over $1 million in legal fees. They had to go get an act of state legislature to get utilities extended to it. Absolute shit show of entitlement. And what is underappreciated is that the next generation of developer builders who might take on a project like that or have the ambitions to dedicate 10, 20 years of their life to building a great place know how the last guy was treated.
Sure. Yeah, they're going to go somewhere else.
I don't know how you calculate 10 years of legal risk. I mean, who has the money or stomach to do that?
I know, yeah. Thinking about this sounds a lot like the Summerfield story.
Totally. That's the exact same.
And Greensboro, also North Carolina. And I don't know that. Actually, I do know that communities do not appreciate that. Leaders in communities tend not to appreciate that if they make it really, really hostile for good developers, the only developers who will be there are those who are sociopaths.
That's right.
That are totally fine dealing with a completely combative permitting process and are just willing to throw lawyers at it. But it is repulsive to people who like other people.
So the sociopathy is symbiotic. That's what has to be understood. So the people who are murdering the local developers to try to stop something either think that nothing will happen in its place, which is naive, or a minority of them, and I think it's like a 90-10% split. The 10% know exactly that will bring in the corporate developer, but the corporate developer might have that sociopathy, and that corporate developer is happy to kiss the ring, is happy to tell the person who yells at developers that they're terrible people. They have to say, sure, we'll give you the park or the green space or the amenity or the affordable housing proffer, and it becomes a symbiotic relationship. So I do think that there's an extraordinary effective partnership between the anti-development left, who mostly identifies as anti-capitalist, and the most ruthless vulturistic capitalists in America. They feed off of each other. And there's no greater...
like financialized development. You call it corporate development, but I would call it financialized development, which is entirely not local at all. Depends upon local developers and builders not being able to get the entitlements.
All that BlackRock and Wall Street investors are doing, they've made a simple bet. They're not idiots. They are betting that NIMBYism is going to win. And they're saying, let's invest in places that can't grow, that have great schools, park our money there. And all the evidence is that in American history, NIMBYism has always won. And so again, there's no greater friend or tool to the financialized development investor industry than the anti-development advocates on the local level.
You're totally right. I remember this was now maybe 10 years ago, but while I was still at Guild Quality, my software company, and we sold to the construction industry, and I went to the Builder 100 conference, which was an invitation-only conference to developers only. You had to be a developer to go, and as a developer of Ion, I qualified for that. And I just went to sit in, but it was all the content was oriented to the 100 largest developers in the country, residential developers in the country. I should say for sale residential developers, so townhouses, homes, those sorts of things. And one of the topics was a consultant presenting on what the regulatory climate was like across the United States. And essentially the recommendation of this person was to you need to target the most regulated markets in the country, because you won't have any competition from your more nimble, smaller, more connected to the community people who, in home building, actually, that you have diminishing returns. If in the absence of a really highly regulated environment, there's diminishing returns for scale. Yeah. Like you actually, a really, really large builder is not as good as a sort of a medium-sized builder because they can be nimble. And this consultant totally distilled it. And he was just speaking like matter-of-factly. Here's where you need to go to build because you won't have any competition.
Right. It gets back to our data point stuff. He's like, the math says you go here, and it has nothing to do with placemaking, and it's nothing to do with bettering community. It has nothing to do with building a more perfect union. It's just the math says invest where you have no competition structurally because of politics. I mean, that's a data point decision.
It is an interest, and I'm being a bit reductionist, I'm sure, with sort of what his presentation was, but the sense was like the South is where the market is. That's where people are moving. They're moving there very fast. And as a reaction to that is you're going to see an explosion in regulatory oversight here in reaction to this growth. Right now, small builders are active there, but they're going to soon not be able to navigate the regulatory environment. And that's
already seen that. Yeah. So
this was 10 years ago. Yeah.
And I know because your model at Ion, which was pretty typical 30 years ago, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Geoff, but people would plat land, the developer would plat land, and then kind of sell builder packages to like 5-10 lots at a time. That's done. You don't see that. Yeah. That hasn't happened in Durham in 10 or 15 years.
As a point of clarification, we did do that. But I don't know the numbers, but at least half of our sales were direct to custom buyers who were designing and building their own house, which is for like little houses was kind of amazing that we had all these people working with architects and custom builders,
which is also mostly a dead model in traditional any neighborhoods, and particularly the tighter the regulatory environment, the less you're going to see that. Partially, I call it
It'll be more specs, less custom, and more specs at scale.
Correct. Yeah. And I call it the California effect, where the tighter a regulatory environment is relative to demand, the more downward pressure there is on architectural quality. And so in California, for really 50 years, the builder would be like, look, I'm going to build a perfectly mediocre house, and you're going to buy it. Like, why would I do better? Like, I don't need to do anything special here. I don't need to compete. Like, there's 100 people.
And even not to, like, everybody wants to build something beautiful, but if it's just a pain in the butt to do something unique, you're just going to start to phone it in. Like, I'm going to check all the boxes.
Yeah.
And what I can do by right, I'll do.
So, people do want to do better, but there are also the production, I guess, is part of the financialized industry, which I think is the majority of home building now. I'm not so sure that's true anymore. I mean, the public builders are completely happy to build perfectly okay mediocrity.
Yeah. Or Ashley Colby, who we've had on, or Ashley Colby Fitzgerald, who we've had on on Yeoman early on. It was episode 4 or 5, maybe early on. Like, but she calls that spreadsheet brain. It's
Totally.
just spreadsheet brain.
Yeah, and I think that's most building now. And so I do think it's a canary in the coal mine when the medium-sized builder goes away. I hate to use the term missing middle, but it's essentially in Durham, there's the big regional builders who probably build a couple hundred homes a year. There's a couple of the nationals that are present. And then the small guys, like, maybe build, most of them 3 to 5 a year. There's a couple who build 10. But it's a real challenge because now that if we're in this world where like micro communities are becoming re-legalized, there's no bench of talent who can build 10 to 30 homes a year. It's completely overwhelming for the little guy, and the big guys is too small. And the scale of sociability is really under threat because once you lose that talent, it's pretty hard to get back.
Yeah, you know, culture's an interesting thing, and that you can't, when things go away, it takes a long time to get them back. But I do think they'll come back. I think I push back, or I question you talking about you're never going to see this in Durham again. I think that we're fewer than 10 years from Euclid either being reversed. Here's my prediction. Saying it here, I've said it a bunch actually, but either Euclid being reversed or severely neutered in such a way that cities will lose. It will be viewed as zoning will come to be viewed as a taking. Yeah, and so cities will lose the ability to restrict property owners' development rights in the manner that they are restricted by the Euclid decision. I liked your talk you did with, I think, Ilya, kind of on this topic, and I'd love to be a fly on the wall if you could get Ari Bargill on this. He's on. So Ari, if you listen to this, know that I very much want to have you on to talk about this topic. And I remember I did a slide deck for you, I think, leading into the Ion Dialogues, which he spoke at, and Ari's a lawyer at Institute for Justice who does these constitutional cases. That I think in my very, very non-qualified approach outlined 10 different constitutional approaches that Euclid could be challenged on. And I'm sure 9 or all of them are difficult in many ways. But it would be amazing to see 1 or 2 constitutional lawyers like poke holes in that on the fly, just saying this might work because of this, or this is totally flawed because this can't work because of X, Y, Z. I do think that there will be a challenge. And if I could write what I would love to happen, and probably never will, I think the challenge to Euclid recognizes that the decision would form a clear dichotomy between urban and suburban. And actually, I think this would be great on a social level for America. And the decision would be very simple, that if your city was chartered before 1926, then it was a taking, and zoning is out the door. It doesn't exist. It was actually illegal. And now we can have the scramble stew that's, I'm sure, is messy to figure out private agreements that make society work. If your city was chartered after 1926, which is probably most of suburban America, right? Then you bought the farm. I mean, you signed up for it. like this is, the city knew what it was getting into, and it wasn't a taking because it basically implemented it when it was chartered. And I, like most urbanists, can talk with a relatively pejorative tone towards suburbia. I don't love it. I wouldn't want to live there. But I also respect that for many people, it's great. And it's actually, they want the consistency. They want the predictability. They want the climax condition. They want it to never change, all these things. And this would actually, such a decision would allow the suburbs to stay suburban and the cities to get on with being urban again, which is what all these fights are about, which I think would be the first flag planting in a new revolution. That sounds, that's optimistic. I like that. That is optimistic. That sounds a bit like kind of going back to, I guess we briefly explored the difference between an HOA and zoning. And you would essentially be treating new places as zoning in new places as development restrictions imposed by an HOA and shouldered willingly. We had Charlie Gardner and I on, it was episode 7, talked about this topic a bit, but whether HOA restrictions or whether deed restrictions should be or were ever intended to be a thing that could persist in the manner they do. Jefferson was generally opposed to those. He called it the dead imposing their will on the living. Life is for the living, not the dead. And I need to go back to that episode and remember what Charlie wrote about it. But we actually talked about revisiting that topic on deed restrictions and how they enable HOAs and how they calcify things for a long period of time in a very zoning-like way, and whether or not whether that's a thing that we ought to be able to have, or like deed restrictions in the or should they be as broadly? Should I be able to say that, should I be able to put a conservation easement on my property and say that no one will ever, 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 ever be able to do anything with it? That sounds kind of an arrogant.
It does, and at its extreme, there's nothing left that's developable, and we end up with these large sort of feudal systems, right? If everything is conservationed out, and this happened to some degree through state and private interest in the Bay Area. Most of the land is undevelopable for similar reasons. And then the flip side of that would be, as a property owner, you have those rights to put those restrictions on, which is a somewhat different question than whether or not that's a good idea.
But whether question of clearly you can, that's a thing you can do. The courts I'm not sure they always have supported one's right to deed restrict their property. And there are restrictions on the lifetime of deed restrictions, but they're effectively perpetual.
That's right.
But ought you be able to? Ought you be able to impose your will on generations many, many years from now? I've got
less of a problem with it. Because I know, maybe you build or own something historic and you want to preserve that in perpetuity. I don't think the risk of the whole world being deed restricted is a serious risk. And there's some respect for the creator or originator, whether it's Ion or a historic building or a Frank Lloyd Wright building or a park that is worthy of protection, whether it's through historic designation or an HOA or deed restriction or something like that. So I don't really have a problem with it while subscribing to the ideas of incrementalism and perpetual change happens, and you should build elasticity into your neighborhoods. And that's really hard to do. I mean, a very fair critique of most traditional neighborhoods, they're beautiful, but they're not elastic. And in that sense, They're not alive, because how much can Seaside or Serenbe or Ion change really in 50 or 100 years? And that is different.
We shall see. My hope is that they change a lot. That a thing that is not changing is dead. Mm-hmm. And so it's certainly right now, it would be very hard to change Seaside in a meaningful way, but the needs of the future are going to be different than the needs of today for housing, for whatever. And I would hope. I mean, kind of in another direction, you look at Detroit. It's probably a good thing that a lot of those buildings were torn down. Mm-hmm. Other people, they would have caved in on people, and they're. I haven't been to Detroit, so I can't really speak of it. But places need to change. If they can't change, then they.
And there's maybe I know that the fundamental benefit of
I'd say Charleston effectively mayn't change, and so as a result, it's a theme park, and that's a harsh criticism.
And so is Seaside, right? I mean, Seaside is a horizontal hotel.
But Seaside was always developed and intended to be. Or I don't know. I actually would love to talk to Robert Davis about this, but my impression is it was sort of developed as a resort,
Well, it was a second home community, and now it's a horizontal hotel. So it's changed because if you own a home there, you're dumb not to Airbnb it because it just mints money. And this is a problem around the world. Barcelona's recently restricted Airbnbs because tourism is taking over the town. You see it all over the Mediterranean coast. And I don't really have a great solution for that other than
build more beautiful places. That's the solution, places. Right?
Yeah.
Is there any other solution, like real solution, other than to build more beautiful places?
Yeah. And there's some, I guess you could scale it at the same rate of wealth growth or population growth that, if you have 10 beautiful places and the population goes up 1 billion people every 10 years, then you're going to have a lot of people who want to be in those 10 beautiful places. So it's not shocking that, the beautiful Greek village is.
And our mobility has gone up so much, like people can travel pretty affordably, travel all over. So it's not just that there are more people, but it's more people with an ability to travel.
Yeah. And it's hard to deal with that at scale because you can build, how scalably can you build a Las Catalinas? I mean, if there's hundreds of millions of people traveling every year, it takes 30 years arc to build a beautiful place that holds.
Have you been down there? Have you been to Las Catalinas?
I would love to go.
I'll try and get Charles on to talk about that.
That'd be awesome.
But I have to say that I don't know that I've seen anything done to that quality as quickly as that project has been. I guess it's about 10 years old now, or it's 10 years since it was started. Look at my watch to guess the year, but maybe it's been a little more than that, 12 years. But it is worth visiting. And that's that's something that would not be, I think their topography forces them to be essentially a master builder if they want to build at the pace that they're building. It is not how I have gone about things or my philosophy of things, but the quality of product has been outstanding. And when I say that, I mean, the Las Catalinas is the master developer and largely designing and building everything and doing much of it custom. Yeah. But the quality of that product is amazing. And so when people are like, oh, we can't build them like we used to, I wish we could still do cool, masonry stuff. And like, go down there and see what they're doing. This is like, take the hardest thing possible. We're going to go to another country and build. And they have recruited outstanding people. They've created a culture of artisanship there among the workers. That's my episode.
It's such an interesting thing. I don't know what the regulatory environment is down there. I know Charles.
It's different. It's very different. Some things are harder and some things are easier.
And I know Charles is an extraordinary developer. I enjoyed meeting him at Ion last year and has had successful developments under his belt, which I'm sure are a big factor there. I do think there's something to be said, and I lose this debate all the time, that you cannot get good unless you allow bad. And that is universally poo-pooed about pretty much anybody I bring that to. And my main comeback is like, well, you're getting bad now. So like, it's not like what we have today is like brilliant stuff. But people are so sort of obsessed with they're brainwashed by this idea that all developers are terrible people and they need to be told what to do. And if only developers listen to them, things would be good and all that nonsense. But the idea is that we have so many handcuffs on and ideas to mitigate that kind of BS narrative that you can't actually do anything good. And anything good requires years of special permissions and public process and kind of nobody left willing to do it. And so I think ultimately this is about creating more space, particularly for the small builder to do good things without having to go through that gauntlet. But on the bigger side as well, sometimes people are leaving the country now to go execute visions because I'm sure Las Catalinas would probably be pretty hard to pull off in Atlanta, Georgia.
Yeah, not possible. Charles and I have spoken about that a bit in Atlanta, Georgia, or in anywhere where there's a ready market of buyers. It would be very difficult to do that. Yeah. I like that point that there cannot be anything. It's hard. You can't have a setting where their greatness happens unless you're also unless bad things can happen as well. It kind of reminds me of like there's no such thing as a compulsory goodness.
Yeah.
You have to be free to do the good thing for goodness to exist.
You can't legislate beauty. And much of the terrible, terrible planning that exists today, both codified planning and process, is built upon the principle that you can legislate beauty. And this underwrites a lot of discretionary review by staff, which usually doesn't end well. And then the endless public boards, which sort of attract people who are not necessarily of good faith to browbeat applicants over what is good and how good they are and how bad the applicant is. And, if they just listen to the good volunteers on the boards who have only their public's interest at heart, all that nonsense originates out of that phenomenon.
No, that's a really good point. I think that's a critique I would cast at particularly the early new urbanists, that thinking you could codify, if we read out these great codes, these really, really long codes, that beauty would result. But really, it is where I have seen great beauty done, it's been in establishing vision and being a cheerleader of great vision and pointing people in a direct, like, this is where I want us to go. And then aggressively recruiting people who can come help, who want to realize that vision.
Absolutely.
And they come in and do it.
And that's very hard work. And credit to you and Vince for doing that. I think the hardest thing to do in life is to convince somebody else that your vision is their vision. I mean, it's particularly over a 20 or 30 year arc is really difficult. And I do think there's we talk about the right scale to do this. A zoning code, a citywide zoning code, is clearly the wrong place to sort of implement a broad brush beauty, right? It's just a terrible scale for it. Now, a development, whether it's Rosemary Beach, Seaside, Ion, or wherever, is about that scale. And I could certainly argue it's a smaller scale, as we have with sort of Ross Chapin's scale of social ability as well. Like, we can create a vision for 16 homes, and that's easier to execute, and you have the ability to be wrong, and it doesn't like ruin anything.
Yeah, small blast radius. Your mistakes have small blast radius.
Well put. But I do think that I don't see them as oppressive zoning codes to say that Ion is only going to be, Victorian and Italianate styles. This is my vision. You can critique that as centrally planned and even authoritarian. I kind of reject that view, because it's a vision statement and it's private, and that's fundamentally different than a planner, which is supposed to be neutral and supposed to be a guardian culture, as Jane Jacobs printed it, is not supposed to be advocating, is not supposed to be pitching their worldview on the marketplace. That's supposed to happen in the private sphere to work. So I think they're fundamentally different. And the vision statements and pattern books for a private development are fundamentally different than citywide zoning.
I agree with that. And I also think there's a lot of nuance in there, and there's a huge amount of diversity in what these sort of neighborhood codes and vision statements have been. Some of them really, really kind of micro-authoritarian. Well,
and I'm sure they've changed too. Like you've run into at Ion, things that didn't work, presumably. And did you change your original charter or HOA documents or whatever?
We had some latitude. That's the difficult thing about the PD process. You have some latitude to make changes on those sorts of things, especially when you, but then after you begin selling lots, it becomes, there's certain things you can change and then other things you can't. So the more experience you get, the less ability you have to make change, which is just the nature of HOAs and
it's a shame, again, a knock on the modern world and how it's sort of incongruent with building great places. Bob Chapman, a developer friend, both of ours, has talked about like the fundamental flaw in the entitlement process now is the planning commissions and sometimes city councils, but all the advocates are saying, we want all the answers. We want the answers. You have to codify it. Like, show us what it is and again, lock it in so it can never change.
Tell us exactly how it's going to be.
And of course they're non-trusting, and some of them think highly of themselves. Some of them think lowly of developers, all that. But particularly when you're on these longer arc projects, which are so rare now, like a walkable development over 10, 20, 30 years, things will change. The big corporation will disappear. Duke will shrink their medical footprint. They'll come up with a new technology that gas will go to $10 a gallon. Who the hell knows?
Yeah.
And so the ability to change as things did happen naturally in our old urbanism, in our old cities. And the ability to do that in the modern world is almost completely gone the way of the dodo, resulting in worse places, more expensive places, less resilient places.
That has certainly been the trend. It's been that, but I think that trend will change.
I hope so. My optimism comes, and I wrote about this in an article I haven't published yet, but off-brand optimism, give you another dose of it. I believe that future is coming, hopefully in a positive sense and not requiring some sort of collapse to get there. But I suspect that the 2030s will be the best decade for American urbanism in a century. And you can already see the cracks in the current system. It is so dominated by boomers stopping things. Like overwhelmingly, when you go to meetings that prevent good development, it is overwhelmingly wealthy, white, highly educated homeowners. And certainly that exists in college towns, but really exists in most of these neighborhoods. Demographically, they fall off a cliff in 2030.
I agree with you.
You can already see the younger generation, some of it YIMBY, but some of it just young families that want better, want the opportunity to own, like urbanism, like walkability. They like interesting things. They want to feel connected through creativity and sort of dynamicism, that they're ready to go. And they're taking charge.
I see that with Gen Z, who's coming up right now. Those folks are totally or not. Well, my view is the ones I know and the little bit I've read is they're not buying into authoritarianism in any of its forms, or I hope that's the case. I think of boomerism less about an age group than a mentality. I think there's some young boomers. I think there's some boomers in the conventional age bracket, but I agree with you. The boomer mentality is about to die.
And there's probably a Venn diagram that's a circle between what you describe as the boomer mentality and I would describe it the suburbanist mentality, which is not transect form dependent. Like you can have a suburban attitude while living in downtown Atlanta or on a farm, but it is these ideas that things need to be fixed, things need to be built to climax condition. Everybody should have a veto over what their neighbor does. The people with graduate degrees should make all the decisions for everybody else. Like this sort of approach to life is under threat. And I think the people who have existed under that system very profitably, socially and financially for the last 50 years, feel that threat and are getting more and more desperate with their responses to the Gen Z and millennials knocking at the door.
Yeah. Aaron, there are so many topics that we said we were going to talk about. And I think the best thing for us to do is visit those and when you come back to Yeoman.
I think that's great. When I did the podcast for the National Town Builders Association, which was well reviewed and seldom listened to, so you can find it over at it's Google or Apple Podcast Town Builders. And I remembered as I was thinking about it, I talked with so many amazing people, and the ability to have these like deep one-on-ones for an hour and a half, like with people who you're cordial with, but you'd never have an hour and a half alone with them to just deep dive into stuff. And one of the things that I regretted I was never able to do was almost like create a culture of, regular guests, because there's so much to talk about and you're figuring stuff out and you're pursuing things with your mountain club and other things you're working on. And you like to get, and someone like Charlie Gardner or Ilya will have very different opinions than me. And, you could keep running these seasons with the same 10 guests.
You're right.
Really interesting.
You're totally right. It's the balance between, there are so many wonderfully interesting and fascinating and good people in the world that have something to say on the larger Yeoman theme of empowering individuals and strengthening communities and battling against the machine. Yep. And then at the same time, all these great, wonderful people you want to you want to digest what you've chatted about with them and reflect on it, and then revisit those same conversations again.
That's what community is, whether it's over Zoom or in person. I'm really grateful for those conversations.
Well, let's remind folks where they can find you. I'll let you do it this time. I did it at the beginning.
Sure. Yeah, you can listen to that podcast, which is slightly dated, but go on Apple Podcasts or wherever, look up Town Builders, and you'll hear me talking to some of the best new urban developers on earth. You can find the nonprofit magazine Southern Urbanism at southernurbanism.org, and my own waxing thoughts over at aaronlubeck.substack.com. And always appreciate people's comments and critiques, tomato throwings, and any other things people have to offer.
Aaron, you're great. I'd also encourage people to follow you on X, Aaron_Lubeck. We'll link to all that in the show notes. Aaron, thank you so much for joining us on Yeoman.
Thanks so much, Geoff. Talk soon.